Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. We're very pleased that you're here. From the RSVPs, we know that all of you bring a lot of deep knowledge and experience on the topics of this workshop today. After the meeting, we'll be circulating a list of attendees, including those of you who indicated on your RSVP that you were okay with our sharing your contact information. And we hope this will give you an opportunity to connect with one another, as well as with others afterwards regarding shared interests and possible collaborations. So welcome again. My name is Esther Conrad. I work at the Haas Center for Public Service at Stanford University. This event is being convened by the Northern California Network for Community Academic Partnerships for Environmental Justice and Teaching Research. This network includes over 160 representatives from community-based organizations, communities, government agencies, faculty, staff, and students from Northern California institutions of higher education who are passionate about community-engaged environmental justice research, teaching, and practice. We co-organize cross-institutional gatherings for community-based research and teaching. Outcomes of these gatherings have included shared models and strategies for effective community-engaged partnerships, the formation of new partnerships and projects, as well as joint fundraising. New members and new leaders are always welcome, and I am going to post some information in the chat about how to get involved, how to join our email list specifically. In addition, I'd like to acknowledge the efforts of some of the co-organizers, Iris Stewart-Frey at Santa Clara University, Sybil Diver at Stanford University, and at the Stanford Environmental Justice Working Group, Catherine Cushing at the San Jose State University and Communiversity, Costanza Rampini at Santa Clara University, and Claire Pache at the Sustainability and Health Equity Lab at UC Berkeley. I will post links to all of these initiatives and that I've mentioned in the chat. And I will go ahead and do that now. And then I would like to just mention as you can see, the focus of this virtual workshop is to share experiences and best practices from organizations who are working through meaningful collaborations to document and reduce inequities in water access, as well as affordability, flood risk, and uneven exposures to water pollution on the local and regional scales. So we are really excited to hear from a wonderful lineup of panelists. I'll go over the agenda in just a minute. If you could advance to the next slide, Catherine. And wonderful, thank you. So we would like to begin this event with a land acknowledgement. So we'd just like to take a moment to recognize the Indigenous peoples and lands in the places where each of you are joining from. And as the event co-organizers, we acknowledge that Stanford University, Santa Clara University, San Jose State University, and UC Berkeley sit on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone peoples. Our universities have played distinct roles in displacing and exploiting Indigenous peoples. At the same time, we recognize the continuing presence and leadership of the Muwekma Ohlone and the opportunity to work in solidarity toward reparations and a more just future, in part through our gathering today. And I will post in the chat a map where you will be able to look for the Indigenous peoples who on whose lands you may sit. Oh, thank you for advancing. So we'd like to begin this event with just a few icebreaker kind of warm-up polls, first getting a sense of who you are representing today, and how many Californians are exposed to unsafe drinking water in their homes, schools, churches, and parks every year. However, before we launch the polls, I'd like to just give a reminder to everyone to put yourselves on mute. And that would be really helpful. And only the speakers, when you speak, you will unmute yourselves. And then when we do have a chance for questions, we will have, you'll be able to unmute. So I'll go over that again, just before we begin. But for now, let's start with the polls. Iris, would you be able to launch the poll? Great. So please note that there are 2 questions here. You will need to scroll down to see the possible answers for the second question. Okay, we're getting a good number of responses so far. Okay, thanks for all your responses. We'll give this another 15, 20 seconds. Okay. Okay, great. So I believe you're all now able to see the poll results. So it looks like we have a great representation of both faculty, researchers, as well as students, nonprofit and community-based organizations, as well as a few community members, state and local government, as well as a few others who are joining us. We're really glad to have all of you here. And for the second question, I should say that in this question, really, we should have said in the poll about how many, not exactly how many, and there may be even more than these suggested answers imply. But I think the majority sort of fell into the 100, the a million or more category, which is correct as far as we know. And I know the speakers will be sharing more details about this. Wonderful. So thanks so much, everyone. Now I'll just move to the next slide. Just a brief overview of our agenda. So we're going to next launch into our panel presentations, and you'll be hearing, I'll be introducing in just a moment, Catherine, who will be sharing a bit about our speakers. Well, then we will have, each speaker is going to present for 10 to 11, 12 minutes, so that we can have a few minutes for questions after each speaker. Then we will, at the end, have a chance for Q&A and discussion around all of the presentations. The event will close at 12:30, but we will have an optional coffee chat for those who are interested in staying on and connecting with one another. All right, so I think I would like to, at this point, hand it off to Catherine Cushing at San Jose State University, who is going to introduce our speakers.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I think you're going to be really happy that you decided to spend part of your beautiful summer July day with us. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, and I want to thank everyone for the time that they took to prepare these really meaningful presentations for you. First, we have Darcy Bostic. Darcy was formerly a research associate at the Pacific Institute, where she worked on groundwater governance and climate change adaptation. Her work investigates how the human right to water can be better integrated into local and state water policies. Darcy holds a BS and MS in hydrologic sciences from the University of California, Davis. And I realized I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Catherine Cushing. I'm a professor in environmental studies at San Jose State University, and also the executive director of Communiversity SJSU. Secondly, we have a team presentation by Dr. Costanza Rampini and Dr. Tiffany Wise-West. Costanza is an assistant professor with me in the Department of Environmental Studies at San Jose State University, where her research focuses on human adaptation to environmental change, specifically people's capacity to adapt to climate change impacts and to recover from extreme events. Her work has focused on communities in Northeast India and in Santa Cruz, California, who are especially vulnerable to coastal and riverine flooding. Dr. Tiffany Wise-West is the Sustainability and Climate Action Manager for the City of Santa Cruz. She's a licensed civil engineer with 25 years of experience in municipal environmental infrastructure and policy planning, design, and implementation. She is the recent and former chair and a current steering committee member of this is going to be a mouthful, hold on a second. The Central Climate Collaborative, and serves on the board of directors for the Central Coast Energy Services, a nonprofit organization providing energy education and services to people in need. So thank you, Dr. Wise-West. Our third presenter is Dr. Heather Lukacs. She is the Director of Community Solutions for the Community Water Center. She has led numerous projects that address drinking water challenges in the San Joaquin and Salinas Valleys. Her diverse background includes research projects on community-based natural resource management, arsenic transport, and point-of-use water treatment. Heather holds a PhD from Stanford and was a faculty member in MIT's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Our third set of presenters includes Marisol Aguilar. Marisol is a lawyer and a Community Equity Initiative Program Director at California Rural Legal Assistance, where she also served as a staff attorney. Her work focuses on environmental justice issues in disadvantaged, unincorporated areas that often lack basic services such as clean water, sewer, and electricity. She received her undergraduate degree in Classic Civilizations and Spanish from UC Davis and her JD from Ohio State University. Next, we have Dr. Iris Stewart-Frey, who is a professor of environmental science at Santa Clara University. Much of her work has centered on the impact of climate change on water resources, the leaching of agricultural contaminants, and the disparities in environmental benefits and burdens in California, the Western US, and Central America. She teaches classes in water resources, water security, spatial analysis, and community-based project work. She is the co-coordinator of the Environmental Justice and the Common Good Initiative at Santa Clara, and a co-organizer of the Northern California Network for Community Academic Partnerships for Environmental Justice Teaching and Research. And we also want to acknowledge Catherine Robinson, who is not able to present with us today, but also helped in the preparation of Iris's and Marisol's presentation. Catherine is a staff attorney for California Rural Legal Assistance, where she also served as a Rural Justice Fellow. She earned her JD from Rutgers University, where she was an Immigrant Rights Fellow. And as a law student, she was a judicial extern for the state of New Jersey's Superior Court. So this is one reason why everyone wants to stay for the coffee chat, because all these speakers are totally incredible and have amazing journeys that they love to share with you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Darcy, who is our first speaker.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all of those wonderful introductions. And thank you for having me, and to Iris and the network for organizing this incredible lineup of speakers. I'm excited to learn from everyone. So I'm here to talk about the vulnerabilities groundwater dependent drinking water supplies face under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. In particular, my research looks at the number of public supply wells and domestic wells that likely need remediation or replacement under SGMA's minimum thresholds, which I'll define later in this presentation. And this work has been done in collaboration with many people, including Rich Paulu, Kristen Dobbin, Amanda Monaco, and Jonathan London, to name a few. So I'm not alone in doing this work, and I want to acknowledge the people who contributed a lot. So first, some context. SGMA was created in 2014 during the last drought. But groundwater levels in the Central Valley have been declining for decades. Groundwater levels, as you see in this chart, decline most steeply during droughts, which are what's highlighted in that light green. And during this last drought, we know more than 2,600 domestic wells or household wells were reported dry. And research by Amanda Fensel shows that low-income communities were disproportionately impacted by well failure during the last drought. And so next slide, please. Responding to the crisis of the last drought, SGMA requires new groundwater sustainability agencies to write something called groundwater sustainability plans that are supposed to prevent something called undesirable results. And undesirable results are defined by these agencies in these plans. So GSAs are not required, although wells went dry during the last drought, they're not required to raise groundwater levels back up to before the last drought, even though many wells went dry, which is arguably an undesirable result of using too much groundwater. And this is just a quote from a consultant in the Kings Basin that says, you know, we're going to continue to decline groundwater levels as long as we aren't causing undesirable results. But there's this, you know, essential question: what is an undesirable result? Next slide, please. So these GSPs decide what undesirable results are and theoretically are supposed to set something called minimum thresholds accordingly. And the minimum thresholds I'm talking about today are the lowest or deepest the groundwater level can go before undesirable results are realized, before bad things happen, essentially. Minimum thresholds are set in wells all across GSP areas. So you see these, you know, little dots in this map on the left. So these minimum thresholds are set at wells. And what we did is we interpolated between all of those well points to get an estimated groundwater surface. So what the groundwater levels would look like if all minimum thresholds across all of these groundwater sustainability plans were reached at the same time. And that's what you see on the right is somewhat of a heat map or a comparison of groundwater levels, minimum threshold groundwater levels across the GSPs that we looked at. And in the San Joaquin Valley, minimum threshold groundwater levels are about 100 feet below present day levels on average. So ideally these minimum thresholds are never reached, but I will argue in the next few slides that undesirable results or the loss of access to drinking water, which violates or prevents California from achieving the human right to water well before, you know, these minimum thresholds are reached. Next slide, please. So my co-authors and I asked the question, are undesirable results realized at these minimum thresholds for drinking water users? In other words, do people lose access to their drinking water source at these minimum threshold groundwater levels? And we looked at where these groundwater levels are below the pumps. So what you see in this diagram here is the pump, which is this like little circle, is submerged in chart A. It's underneath the groundwater level. And in chart B, the groundwater level is well below the depth of the pump of the well, but we're also looking at, is the groundwater level just below the pump? Next slide. So we find that well before minimum thresholds are reached, over 50% of domestic wells in the San Joaquin Valley are impacted. Nearly 10,000 domestic wells have pumps that will be above groundwater levels or will go dry, as you can see here on the right. So what you see in this chart is that for each 10 feet of groundwater level decline, you see a certain percentage of what we estimate to be active wells in the San Joaquin Valley. This is likely an underestimation of active wells, but it's based on the statewide well completion report data set. So for each 10 foot of groundwater level decline, we see a percentage of wells currently active based on 2019 groundwater levels that could fail. And the minimum threshold is where that red line sits. So that's the average minimum threshold for the San Joaquin Valley. These are all of the wells in the San Joaquin Valley and the percent of them that could fail. So we see that these minimum thresholds are really public policy decisions, and it can be changed with, you know, trade-offs in water use in other areas. So ultimately, if groundwater levels reach minimum thresholds, there are likely many, many people who will be impacted. And I see it. Iris has a question. How is sustainability defined in Sigma if groundwater levels do not need to be brought back up to pre-drought levels? Yeah, so sustainability is defined by the avoidance of undesirable results, which are locally determined. And so what you see here is that if wells, even before minimum thresholds, even before this red line, there are large percentages of domestic wells that are likely to lose access and to need either remediation by well lowering, pump deepening, well deepening or pump lowering, or replacement of the well altogether. Next slide, please. So public supply wells are also vulnerable to minimum thresholds. About 42% or 500 of the about 1,200 public supply wells I looked at in the San Joaquin Valley are likely to be impacted or to go dry, meaning that their estimated pump location will be above the minimum threshold groundwater level. Most water systems have at least one impacted well. So here I connected wells to water systems to understand how many wells water systems have and ran the analysis of vulnerability accordingly. There are 65 water systems that have more than 70% of their wells impacted, and these are often small water systems with about 1 to 2 wells who are in this extreme vulnerability category. We do see that a large number of water systems are in this high vulnerability category with over 30% of their wells needing remediation or replacement. And together in the high and extreme vulnerability categories, we see about 1 million people served by these water systems who are impacted. Next slide, please. So water systems in white and high income zip codes are more likely to have functioning water systems under these minimum thresholds water levels. And in low income areas and in communities of color, there are at least 60 water systems with at least 30% of their wells impacted. So in communities, low income communities and communities of color, these areas are more likely to have water systems who will face challenges in accessing groundwater as water levels decline. Next slide, please. So luckily, these systems and drinking water stakeholders have a coalition of incredible advocates working on their behalf. We're starting to see the impacts of this advocacy on DWR reviews. So the Department of Water Resources, which is a statewide department, gets to say, this is a good plan or a bad plan, we accept this plan, or this plan needs revisions. And we have 3 reviews so far for about 30 plans that have been released. And in June, DWR told 2 groundwater sustainability plans that they need to show why their minimum threshold levels were picked and have specific discussion about the impacts on shallow and domestic wells before their plans would be approved. So that was exciting to see that DWR is acknowledging in part that domestic wells and shallow wells are beneficial users and should be considered in these definitions of minimum thresholds. One note though, that these plans will not address the impacts that we are facing during this drought, and we need to be cognizant that there are many vulnerable public supply wells and domestic wells during this, as groundwater levels continue to decline during this drought. So we should be paying attention to that. And with that, that is my presentation. So yeah, thank you all for listening. Happy to answer any questions.
So it looks like one question came in through the chat. The question is, does the state have any say in the definition of undesirable results if a local GSA has very lax standards?
Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see in these reviews what the state says. I think this is really a decision point for the state. The quote by the consultant was in a public meeting and was recorded by Chris Austin, who runs Maven's Notebook, and it is publicly available.
If there's time, I have one other question. Who's actually at the table when these minimum thresholds are being set?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Kristen Dobbin has done a lot of great research on who is in charge in these and included in the decision-making process of these GSAs. It's often not domestic well users or public supply or water systems. It's often irrigation districts. Sigma requires that you be a public agency in order to be a GSA. And so a lot of irrigation districts, counties, and other entities that have perhaps more agricultural interests or historically have had more agricultural interests are often have a larger seat at the table. Thank you all.
So we're going to move to our next speaker, which are Tiffany and Costanza.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Iris. It's lovely to be here today. And Costanza and I are going to tag team our presentation. I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm talking to you from the territory of the Awaswas speaking Yupi tribe, which is now stewarded by the Amamutsan tribal band. Let's go ahead and get into the next slide, please. So I'm with the city of Santa Cruz, and I am responsible for our strategy, leading both the community and our internal city on our emissions reduction strategy, as well as our climate adaptation work, or how we deal with the impacts of climate change. And since over a decade ago, if you want to go ahead and continue with maybe 3 more taps, the city of Santa Cruz has developed, in conjunction with this local hazard mitigation plan, climate adaptation plans that have been updated to characterize the spatial and temporal projections we're expecting from various hazards. Everything from, we're nestled against the Pacific Ocean and the Santa Cruz mountain range. So we have everything from sea level rise to increased intensity and occurrence of wildfires and everything in between. So today we're really going to be focusing on the nexus between flood hazards, water supply, and sea level rise for our frontline community, which is the beach flats. In our So our last adaptation plan was adopted in 2018, along with our local hazard mitigation plan that's approved by FEMA and enables us to be eligible for certain categories of pre and post hazard mitigation funding. So coupling that with adaptation has given us leverage to be able to access funding for our adaptation work. Next slide, please. After our 2018 plan, we embarked upon a 2-year sea level rise project called Resilient Coast Santa Cruz, where really we needed to address a variety of topics in utilizing an equity lens. And you can see the various topics that we addressed. And if you tap again, we were looking for outcomes that really created an inclusive conversation that developed this community vision for resilient future management in the face of climate change, looking at both near term and setting the stage for medium and longer term solutions, really again with the eye towards a resilient and equitable future coastline. Next slide, please. And I mentioned that in our 2018 climate adaptation plan, for the first time, we characterized social vulnerability to climate change. And what you see on the screen on the left side is a social vulnerability score based on 5 different factors locally by census block group that were then ranked relative to one another. And the red census block groups are those with the highest social vulnerability. When we overlay our climate hazard zones, and you can see the little blue blurbs that represent our combined coastal hazards of erosion, sea level rise, and flooding, you can see that some of our high social vulnerability census block groups overlap with these hazard zones. meaning we need to pay particular attention to tailoring our strategies to help those folks first. So if you look where the star is, this is our Beach Flats community. It is a highly diverse 4-acre area behind our boardwalk, which is a major tourism area and main beach. It's primarily residential, but it does have hotels and other businesses, a community center, park and garden, about 2,000 residents that are also uniquely characterized because this is a very low income area of town, and we have a high degree of Spanish speakers in this area. And of course, this is our frontline community in terms of flooding and sea level rise. You can see also we have a very young population in this area. And we knew through this Resilient Coast Initiative, this 2-year sea level rise planning initiative, that we really wanted to focus in on the beach flats. And this is where Costanza and her team really came in to add the capacity that was needed for the city to begin to develop these relationships and conduct some research to really help us to start to tailor those strategies. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Costanza to talk a little bit more about what we did in the Beach Flats area.
Great, thank you. I'll take the next slide, please, Catherine. So as Dr. Wise-West mentioned, the Resilient Coast Initiative comes at the heels of a lot of other initiatives. And there's a lot of efforts that are part of the Resilient Coast Santa Cruz. And so what I thought that I would focus on for today, or we would focus on for today, is really the part that her and I did together, where our collaboration really happened. And so what we did, and Dr. Wise-West reached out to me, asking me if I could help with household interviews in the Beach Flats neighborhood, again, with the idea that this is a neighborhood that should get priority when it comes to thinking about adaptation and thinking about coastal risk, that they should be prioritized because they're the most vulnerable and least represented often. And so I was able to recruit lots of wonderful San Jose State students, graduate and undergraduate, as well as UC Santa Cruz students, volunteers who came out, and we did 126 interviews, household interviews, knocking on doors over several weekends, I believe, in fall 2019. And what we really wanted to ask through these interviews was, what are people's risk perceptions? What is people's understanding of the combined risk that they face due to the fact that they're right by the river and also by the Pacific Ocean? And so one thing we wanted to really understand is, what is the level of understanding of these risks? The other thing that we wanted to really be able to assess and start to evaluate was, what is people's capacity and preparedness towards these risks, right? What do they currently do when there is a king tide, when there is flooding in the beach flats and there is water and you can't get out of your house without wading in water, or walking in water, not really wading. And then finally, what we wanted to really know was, what are people's values? What do people really value about their neighborhood? Given that some choices may have to be made. And also, what are solutions that people think are needed and desirable right now? And so I think the idea here is to really try to create a collective understanding of the problem, but also to create a collective imagination of the possible solutions that is inclusive of these voices. So I'll go to the next slide, please. And I'm putting this up here just to acknowledge the fact that community engagement and outreach can mean a lot of different things, right? And it can take more or less democratic forms, or it can basically, just tokenize particular groups and sort of, be a performative exercise. And so what I wanted to discuss was, how is the Resilient Coast Initiative, trying to move towards the right of this spectrum, towards a more democratic engagement and towards a more democratic and just outreach and community engagement. And so I will go to the next slide now. So I just want to talk about a few things that I think worked really well and helped the Resilient Coast Initiative move toward the direction. And I think Dr. Wise-West would agree that, we're not there necessarily, right? There's still a lot more efforts to do, but I think there's been a valiant attempt to at least move the needle a little bit. And so one thing that is very key and that I want to stress is time. it takes time to build trust with these community members, with community leaders. And after the slide, Tiffany will show you again all the things that her and her team did before we did those 126 interviews and afterwards. So this was just part of a much larger effort and a very long-term effort to build ties and build trust with this community in the Beach Flats, and particular community members and leaders within that community. The other thing is leveraging academic partnerships. So one thing I want to acknowledge is that Dr. Wise-West and I met through our PhD program at UC Santa Cruz in environmental studies. And our personal relationship has been really important in maintaining our collaboration, right? So I think it's good to acknowledge that the personal relationships also really matter, and being able to work together well also depends on having that. And Dr. Wise-West has also been able to really leverage partnerships with other institutes that, we are surrounded by a lot of really fantastic research institutions. And so, I did the same in trying to reach out to undergrads and grad students, both at San Jose State and UC Santa Cruz. So I think overall, you'll see at the end, we have a list of grants that we want to just show you that we've applied for. And you'll see that there's a lot of different institution and partnerships that have happened throughout. Lots of meetings, one-on-one meetings with unrepresented communities, focus groups with particular members of different communities. So again, lots of time spent building those relationships. And then finally, really trying to understand, how can we step back and let the community lead instead? And I'll go to the next slide, please. Okay, so Tiffany here, back to you.
All right, thank you, Costanza, for sharing that. And as you can see on the screen here, in addition to the interviews that we conducted and the focus groups, we did a lot of other engagement in the community, including, I want to point out, our virtual reality Sea Level Rise Explorer application that's available in Spanish and English, that we utilized as an education, but also a survey tool. And so I encourage you all to check that out at cityofsantacruz.com/resilient coast, as well as all of the other deliverables and the summaries for this project. And one of the things that we tried to do is that every time we met with groups, we tried to summarize back to them, this is what we heard, and give them an opportunity to correct us or to add things, and also to strive to keep them apprised of how this is flowing through the technical products of our project, which included a public works plan and a policy document that is still in development. So we can go ahead and go on to the next slide, please. As Costanza mentioned, we did, I also collaborate with Middlebury Institute, with UCSC's Coastal Science and Policy Graduate Program, again, really helping to bring capacity. This kind of tells in a little more detail. We did conduct meetings down in the Beach Flats Garden. We also tried to distribute reverse 911 calls so that folks made sure they got notification of when flooding was happening or when evacuation needed to happen. We also just simply wanted to have a presence at other cultural and community events where maybe we were talking about climate work, but really just wanted to show support for the community. We also had participation of some community leaders on our technical advisory committee throughout the project. And I have to admit that there are some things that didn't work. On the right-hand side, you can see we had a community meeting scheduled that ended up getting canceled because of COVID. We had a virtual makeup meeting and we actually had no participants. So we're finding that things like virtual workshops are not going to get people to these frontline people involved. It's really the one-on-one meetings, relationships, and showing up for these events. Next slide, please. And, these are some things that outcomes that we heard from folks through our interviews. And what we learned was really beyond, sea level rise and flooding, but we learned about other issues in the community that perhaps other areas within the city are responsible for, and look to connect those things up. Things like, we found that there's mold in buildings that have been flooded over time and so forth. So you can see that there are a number of things that we're hearing. And then the next slide, I think, includes, no, it doesn't. We have some short and longer term strategies that the community has suggested, and this has really flowed through some of our accessibility products and so forth. And we really acknowledge there needs to be a longer term, more comprehensive strategy that is developed with our frontline community leading in the future. So the next slide then is really us winding up here on some of the challenges. And again, Costanza, please jump in here. But you know, we really struggled with how to compensate community partners to really ensure their ongoing engagement. That is something that we've sorted out for a next step project we have right now. But in the past, we provided gas cards and, you know, other types of things to gain participation that, you know, had mixed results. Also, it's really important to acknowledge that the length of a project or the pace of a project that's grant funded is not the same pace of building trust. And so we need to make space for that, and funders need to acknowledge that. And I also mentioned relating our work to other issues people care about, things like affordable housing and so forth, which of course this is linked to. And then of course, COVID and our own internal capacity certainly limits what we can do, although we really strive to leverage every resource we have. So I'll turn it over to Costanza to finish out challenges and the funding. And that's our last slide then. Next slide.
And I know we're out of time, so I'll just really stop here. And I just want to just show, if you could just click to the next slide, Catherine. I just thought that I would put this up here because these are various grants that Tiffany and I have spent many of our summer days applying for. And so this is just, you know, some of the calls for grants that we felt really targeted or were very, you know, focused on communities and on coastal resilience and had an EJ aspect that we could leverage to do community outreach. So, you know, it's not easy to write a grant with 10 academic and non-academic partners, as Dr. Wise-West will tell you. But, you know, these are just different calls that I think we should all be looking out for, because all of us probably have projects that could fall within the purpose of these grants, and also thinking about how we may collaborate on some of these. So I'll end here.
Thank you so much, Tiffany and Costanza. I failed to introduce myself before. I'm Claire Pace from the Water Equity Science Shop, and I'm going to be helping facilitate some of the questions. In the interest of time, I've noted some of the questions that have come in through the chat, and we're going to get to them in the discussion session. So thank you for posting those. Please continue to post those. And at this point, I think we're going to move forward to our next presentation to keep on track. Next, we have Heather Lukacs from the Community Water Center, who's going to present on community-based research partnerships in environmental justice communities in the central and coastal San Joaquin Valley. Thanks so much, Heather.
Great. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay, Claire and everyone? Yes. Great. Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to present today and to share with you. As mentioned, I'm Heather Lukacs with the Community Water Center. Some of you who are familiar with the Community Water Center may not know that we now have an office in Watsonville, so Santa Cruz County represented in the last two presentations, and also in Visalia, where most of our work happens in the San Joaquin Valley, and we have a policy office in Sacramento. And we are still led by our co-founder and executive director, Susana de Anda, and we have been working alongside impacted community members for over 14 years. Most of those impacted community members are represented through the Agua Coalition, who you all may know, which also expanded to the Central Coast last fall. So we have an integrated program working on community-driven solutions. And our focus is really on the human right to water in California and implementing that to try to get safe water to all Californians. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about who we are, and then I'll get into some around academic and other partnerships. Our mission, next slide, please. Our mission is to act as a catalyst for community-driven drinking water solutions. And we do this through organizing, education, and advocacy. And I just want to say the last presentation really talking about community trust and the time and effort and relationship building it takes is very central to our work. You can see here a picture of a community meeting, or what we call a plática, where we really develop those relationships and connect with community leaders. Our vision is to ensure that all Californians have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. And we do have a strong track record of policy wins from working alongside directly impacted residents, a lot of other organizations and groups throughout the state to advocate for more sustainable and just water policies. Now, as mentioned earlier in the poll, most of you got this right, but there's over 1 million people in California who lack access to safe drinking water. Now, this is only, thanks for the slide change, this is only for those who are served by public water systems. In addition, there are many more throughout the state reliant on private wells who also may not have access to safe drinking water. Now, we started our work in the Central Valley and Central Coast mostly around issues related to nitrate, but now we're also seeing things like 1,2,3-trichloropropane, arsenic, and other contaminants that pose a significant health risk. Next slide, please. And as many of you all know, we have an environmental justice focus, and these were a couple of very key research studies. So when we talk about research questions and studies that have relevance to communities on the ground, these research studies that are referenced here really show that it's an environmental justice issue. Access to safe drinking water in California is. Really, if you are a community of color or low income, you're more likely to be impacted by unsafe drinking water, disproportionately impacted. Next slide. And so the approach that we use at Community Water Center is really to focus on the most impacted communities in the state and make sure they're part of the decision-making process to drive solutions. And we build community power and engage leadership through these 3 core issues that are focused here on this slide. For us, fundamentally, we have to protect the source of drinking water, which is in sort of the bottom right corner of this slide. We have a groundwater protection program to ensure safe and reliable drinking water supply. We also have to secure access to funding, and that's a big part of our Sacramento advocacy, is making sure we have funding for these solutions, for adequate infrastructure and affordable water rates. And then lastly, it's about supporting institutional capacity, which has to do with technical, managerial, and financial capacity at the local level to really sustain solutions once implemented. And together, we think all of these together are necessary. You can forward the slide, something should appear if you click it. Yeah, for reliable access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. So that's really our approach. Next slide, please. And so I communicated with my colleague who's presented to some of you in the group before, Ryan Jensen, on this. And we really talked about what are we looking for in a partnership. Now, this could be academic. We work a lot with consultants. We partner a lot with other organizations, other community-based organizations, cities, water systems, and others. And these are some of the questions that we ask. You know, when we come into this partnership, is it a partnership of equals? Is it a true partnership? And I think this is an interesting one. And for all of you, my career has also been split between academia and doing this community-based type work. And I think it's a hard question to really consider. You know, who's driving the research? Where does the question and kind of curiosity for the research question, where did that originate? And also, who's going to benefit from the results? You know, it's important in academia, as we all know, you have to produce publications. But how does this information return to the community and really impact community residents' lives? One of the sticky questions we've gotten into with a couple of research partnerships is, what if the feedback we get from the community, or what if the feedback that the researchers get from our center, what if it kind of contradicts what they were expecting? How do you kind of resolve these issues of interpretation of results, meaning of results, if you have a difference between a community member perspective and an academic researcher perspective? Kind of who has the power in this, and who ultimately decides? I think depending on the situation, that can be different, and it's really interesting and important to consider. Similarly, there's questions about ownership of data, confidentiality in data, transparency, things like that, authorship. And so I think I just want to leave some of these questions here. And we have we work in partnership with many researchers who are part of this meeting and have many successful partnerships. And I think what we look for is this last question: how does the impact of the research the actual project proposed, how does that align with our internal priorities? We have campaigns every year, and we have limited staff time. So we really look at where those come together. And the most successful research projects, they're completely integrated. The work we're doing with our team is one and of the same as the research work that we're doing. And so that's what we really strive for. And we can get more into that in some of the Q&A if people are interested. I'll just say that, there's different ways of knowing, as many of you on this call realize. And we really want to make sure that the lived experience, the everyday experience of community members who are impacted by unsafe drinking water, that their experience is represented in what we do. And that holds for everything, for advocacy, community-driven solutions, and also any research process or products. I think I've covered all of this. I think one of my colleagues summed up this slide by saying that what we really look for is we want a research partnership that brings as much to the community as the community brings to the research. So thinking about this reciprocal relationship. You can move on to the next slide, please. So I wanted just to briefly highlight a few different types of partnerships that Community Water Center is currently engaged in that really support our community-driven solutions as well as our advocacy work. And the first one here is this framework for drinking water, for a drinking water well impact mitigation program. It's a mouthful. All of these are on our website under community and academic partnerships. You can click, download them, and read more about them. And this one's really interesting. So building on Darcy's presentation, the first one, this was really informed by Community Water Center's work on SGMA and drinking water protection in these groundwater plans. And what we found is that they're insufficient. We're going to see that, as she mentioned, wells are going dry during the drought right now, even though we have SGMA. So what does it mean? And we're active. We worked with other partners at Leadership Council, Self-Help Enterprises, other organizations, and we informed by a technical advisory committee, many researchers, and we came up with this framework. And now we're advocating. We want all groundwater agencies to adopt this framework. My coworker is giving a presentation today in the Pajaro Valley, requesting that this get adopted by the Pajaro Valley Water Management Agency. So we haven't given up and saying, like, we still need better sustainable management criteria, but we want the groundwater agencies to adopt this mitigation program. If someone's well goes dry as a result of their actions, they need to step in and help replace that well or connect someone to a larger water system. So that's just an example. This framework is really central to our advocacy. It was a great partnership with many different groups and researchers. The next one is in the middle. I won't go into this in great detail, but this is the drinking water tool. I apologize, it's fuzzy. But Claire Pace, who's here, and others from the Water Equity Science Shop at Berkeley, this was a great partnership to really make the data more accessible to community members, to my staff, our team, and to others. Thank you for adding that link. And we're currently in the process, I'll get into this more, of updating it, but it's how can we take all this available data at the state and really make it relevant and accessible to people who are impacted and people working for solutions. And that's a great partnership. We've had a long-term partnership with the Water Equity Science Shop at Berkeley, very reciprocal in terms of how the projects are developed. And so I wanted to highlight that. And then the last case here, this is really interesting, and it relates to a future panelist today, which is why I included it. But we worked on this white paper about developing equitable and effective early action plans. You'll hear more about CV salts. This is in the Central Valley to address nitrate contamination. We said, if growers need to address this nitrate contamination, there's a lot of questions around what does it actually cost? Not just to say, put a system in, but to maintain it, to do the education and outreach to really reach people. So I think this is a really interesting project. Next slide. And I'll just close by, these are a few of our kind of looking forward things we're working on now and that are ongoing or that we're planning in the future. So I already mentioned update the drinking water tool. We're looking to update this and keep this relevant, primarily through incorporating new data layers from the state And we're also ground truthing those data layers with our community outreach and pushing the state to make them better and more relevant. The second thing is we are developing new research projects around PFAS and other non-regulated contaminants. There's through targeted and non-targeted sampling. And we've been working on some proposals, grant proposals and others with research partners to that effect. But that is very much on our radar. Yeah, we don't know the extent of these contaminants throughout the state, and it's going to be really important that we holistically address drinking water contamination issues. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention, I oversee, I'm our Director of Community Solutions. My work is really the hard role in the team that I work with is saying, okay, how can we get safe water to people? So we have contracts with the state water board, technical assistance contracts. And this year, we're really focusing on pilot projects, pilot to scale. What can we learn from pilot projects that can be implemented statewide? And so these are two of the things we're working on. We're working on a 1,2,3 trichloropropane point of entry treatment pilot project in North Monterey County. And we're also doing these alternatives analysis to say, you know, what are the long-term drinking water solutions for these really hard to reach communities throughout the state? And I know I think I'm at time, so I'll go to the next slide. I am happy to elaborate more on any of the things I've touched on. I know it was really high level today. You could also have my email address here, and we're on social media and our website. You can sign up for our e-news if you haven't already to stay informed about what Community Water Center is doing. And I'll just end by saying I'm just one part of a really great team at Community Water Center. And we also include the Agua Coalition and other community partners, you know, in the team, and so and research partners. So it really takes a collective to address these issues. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Heather, for that excellent presentation. Just one brief question that was posed by Iris. How do you primarily fund reciprocal research partnerships at Community Water Center?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think we've funded them in a variety of ways. So I think I was looking at this earlier, I think with the drinking water tool, and Claire, you may know this, but I think the West team receives support from like maybe a research funding source, maybe NSF, and Community Water Center receives support from DWR associated with our Sigma work and a Sigma related grant. Is that correct?
We were NIEHS Superfund.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry, NIHS Superfund. But I think we often get approached by researchers who have, you know, maybe it's Superfund, maybe it's larger NSF or other research funding opportunities. And I will say for those can be great, but you have to start really early and kind of reach out and make sure that we have that right synergy and right balance in those types of grants. But I think we're open to, and we have a really great director of strategic partnerships, who's our main fundraiser and can help kind of stitch together funding partnerships. The most successful are also those who extend throughout time and include funding for us, because we, as a nonprofit, we have to also pay our staff to ensure that we can continue doing the work that we do. So I would say for those who are interested, this is a key piece that you can help us with.
Well, thanks so much. And there's so much material, and looking forward to asking more questions during the discussion.
Thank you.
And our next presentation is by Iris Stewart-Frey and Marisol Aguilar on driving policy changes and addressing nitrate pollution in Central Valley domestic wells through the CV Salts program.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, so this was a great collaboration that we were able to have between California Rural Legal Assistance and Santa Clara University. So let's go ahead and get started with the next slide. So California Rural Legal Assistance is a nonprofit legal aid. We serve low-income residents throughout California. And one of the areas that we work in is water insecurity. We look at the quantity of water, ensuring that community residents have enough water, look at the quality and at the cost. And our main focus is on these unincorporated disadvantaged communities that other presenters have already touched on, so I won't touch on right now. So let's go to the next slide, please. So as mentioned also before, there are a variety of issues facing these low income and unincorporated communities. Around water, there's a big issue, especially because there's such lax regulation of agriculture. And we know agriculture is one of the primary pollutants when it comes to nitrates. They also just pump out a lot of water, and so we have a lot of community residents that can go and have dry wells when a deeper well comes in right next to them. We know low-income minorities are disproportionately affected by water quality, water access, and there's just a huge power imbalance between residents and industry. And so it's always our residents who get the short end of the stick. So let's go to the next one. And so there was an opportunity to provide clean drinking water for community residents, and that came in the form of the CV SALTS program. So the Central Valley Salinity Alternatives for Long-Term Sustainability. And so this program has sort of 3 steps to it. So the first one, you have dischargers, so agriculture mostly, that discharge nitrates into the groundwater. They had to come together, form a collaborative in their management zone, and start developing some plans to address nitrate and salt pollution. So the first one is the second step right here, the early action plan. And so they had to develop this plan with short-term immediate solutions to provide clean drinking water to affected community residents. That could include everything from free well testing, free bottled water, free point of use, and other things that could be useful. Then down the line, there was the opportunity, well, the mandate to create a longer-term management zone implementation plan to address nitrate contamination in groundwater. But we were focused on this second step, which was the early action plan. So let's go to the next slide. So like I said, it was a great opportunity for our community residents to get a little bit of help by getting clean water. And so the first thing that we do at CRLA is we'll look at the program, we'll analyze it to make sure that it's legally compliant. We are a law firm, but then we also have this community-based approach. And so we want to make sure that the program will work for those that are affected. So we'll look at making sure that there's language access so everybody can take advantage of this program, that there's robust public outreach and participation to ensure people actually know about it, and also eliminate any barriers to applying for the program. The other thing that we wanted to look at was to ensure that the program was as protective as possible. And so this section was going to involve delving into the data a lot. And as a law firm, we do not have the expertise to really do that data analysis that was required. So we were fortunate enough to be able to partner with Iris and Santa Clara University to look into some of the issues that we couldn't address ourselves. So things like data analysis, was the analysis a fair analysis? Were they using complete data? Was it accurate data? Were they making unreasonable assumptions to fill in gaps? We wanted to make sure that the affected areas were the ones that were going to get help. We also wanted to make sure we had a good understanding of nitrate contamination. How do nitrate levels fluctuate? What affects fluctuation and things like that. And I skipped well testing. So making sure that we had the best knowledge on when to test wells, how wells should be tested, how often they should be tested. We know that they should be tested, but all of those other questions are something that researchers can really help us to understand. And also the data that's needed to monitor the progress. So we can advocate for a program that will allow us to monitor progress, but we don't really know exactly what we can ask for. And then we also wanted a partner who could explain the need for data transparency, who could really explain what data should be public, why it should be public. And so for this, I'll turn to Iris, who can give a summary of the work that they did on that area.
Yes, thank you, Marisol. So I have been working with my research group in the larger Modesto Stanislaus County region, a lot of it with the Tuolumne River Trust, another community-based organization. And we've been working on mapping pollution sources along the Tuolumne and access to green spaces, developing the Tuolumne River Regional Park, incorporating EJ principles, but also aspects like pesticide application around unincorporated or disadvantaged unincorporated areas. and general groundwater contaminants and how those are moving through the soil. And at one of those community panel meetings, similar to the one we're at today, I think Marisol and Catherine and I, we got connected, and they asked me to help review this early action plans for the CV salts program, as we have been working with the well data. And so there's this is a prime example here where policy is being made and stipulated. And in these early action plans, the management zones talked about making risk maps based on available data and presented maps, similar to the one that you see on the slide here. So this is the map that we made, but it's a risk map. So it shows how likely nitrate is in shallow wells. And the red colors denote the highest risk for the highest concentrations, and then the green colors, there is little or no risk to that. However, when we tried to look into that data and reproduce what they have done, we found that not all data that they listed was available, even after months of inquiry. And the description of the analysis and the parameters used was insufficient. We tried to reproduce and their analysis and demonstrated the role that data availability and the analysis parameters have on actual outcome. So if you choose a particular way of interpolating between wells, for example, what does that do to your risk map? The consultants tend to present maps and data in a form that makes it a definite answer without presenting the uncertainties that can be involved. So I think it is important to communicate that also to the communities, because they're the most affected. If you're, let's say at the border of a red to an orange or an orange to a yellow zone. So this is where it matters the most, and this will need to be incorporated in those maps, and we were able to demonstrate and then also present that at workshops in the process. Next slide, please. And I just want to show a couple of other things that we were able to do. One is we were able to analyze and visualize the most recent data. If you rely on somebody else's visualizations, they might be out of date, or they might not be the exact analysis that you would prioritize. So here we plotted in the graph on the lower left, nitrate concentration versus well depth. And with the most recent data, and showing that a lot of the shallower wells between 50 and 100 feet have some of the highest nitrate concentrations, and those are the ones that people that need to rely on domestic wells are most likely to tap, more likely than the deeper agricultural wells. So everything that's in that orange circle on that graph is very high nitrate concentrations. And in the map on the upper left, we show the relationship between disadvantaged unincorporated communities and unincorporated communities in the greater Modesto region to nitrate contamination in shallow wells. So this highlights the importance of giving people a false sense of security if you're just relying on one map that a consultant has produced in one period of time without considering how the situation might change over time. And next slide, please, Catherine. So for example, we were also able to map the, for wells with high nitrate concentrations and a lot of data availability, how those concentrations varied not only throughout the year or throughout the years, but also over time, over the last 10 years, going up right to 2021. So on the graph on the left shows that there is actually a statistically significant variability between nitrate concentration based on seasons that had not been acknowledged in these early action plans, where the suggestion was to do well testing once a year. And also that, on the right, that nitrate concentrations in any given well can fluctuate widely between above the MCL and below the MCL. So just taking one snapshot in time is not enough to protect people's health. So with that, I'd like to pass the mic back to Marisol and to the next slide.
Yes, thank you, Iris. And so with this information, we were able to identify a host of issues with the program that separately we wouldn't have been able to identify. So we were able to develop joint comments based on the science and the data, as well as our community-based and legal-based work. So this is a list of the comments. You'll see some of the blue ones are more the data-driven scientific comments, and the red ones are more the community-based legal comments. So let's go to the next slide. And so we were able to get quite a bit of changes in the early action plan, which is great for our community residents. There's still more to do, and Iris will be talking about that a little more. But so now all data involved will be publicly available. There's going to be a description of the procedures, full data sets. So that'll be great for data transparency. We're also going to be, we were also able to get retesting of wells that were close to the maximum contamination level, even though they didn't go over the contamination level. They're developing plans for co-contaminant testing, and we'll be considering seasonal fluctuations and other trends that the data can identify. On the community-based side, owner consent, if it was a landlord and a renter, was going to be a huge barrier. And so we were able to get a commitment to use the water board's enforcement power to address that issue. And also we'll just be continuing that dialogue to evaluate more options. For public participation, we of course amplified the voices of our community residents, and now there's a more robust and mandatory public participation. And then lastly, something that I really liked was we were able to get a more commitment for more frequent and more comprehensive reporting, and get real-time tracking on how many residents were receiving well tests, how many residents were receiving water. So we can really see how the program is progressing and give us a good sense of, give them a good sense of accountability to the residents who are affected. So overall, it was a great partnership, great results. And Iris, you want to talk about some of the other projects we'll work on together later?
Well, I know we're out of time, so I just want to quickly mention that CV Cells is a program that has just started last year. The implementation is on the time horizon over 35 years, so there will be lots more opportunity to collaborate. Next steps are the preliminary management zone plans for long-term solutions, but also related issues like the current State Water Resources Control Board racial equity resolution. There's also opportunity for joint projects and fundraising and networking with other community organizations, community and academics. So, thank you for letting us go over a little bit here. And if you would like to get in contact with us, there's the information.
Thank you so much for such a great presentation. And just one question that came up is, are the results of the CV Cells Research Partnership available to the public, and could we share the link?
So we definitely have the comment letter, which is sort of the summary of all our work together. So we would be happy to share that comment letter that we submitted.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you. I know there are a variety of other questions that we'll hold for the discussion. Oh, which is right now. So at this point, I would like to invite people to either unmute yourselves and then in order to ask a question, or to put your questions in the chat. And I'm happy to manage the questions that come through the chat. I'd invite questions both for specific presenters and also sort of big picture questions about some of the themes that are coming up throughout today. If anybody wants to get started, they are welcome to, or I can pose a question that's come in from the chat. Okay, so we had a great question come in from Brian Liu earlier, asking how well can the lessons of these community scale programs be generalized nationally or globally? And that's sort of open to any of our presenters who'd like to think about.
That's something I could take. I want to mention that the city, as well as a number of our academic collaborators, are involved in an international collaboration called CTs, the Ocean Climate Platform, that focuses on 5 coastal areas throughout the world, including the west coast of California, or of the United States rather. And really we're sharing best practices. We've learned quite a bit, particularly on our Next Step project, which is a coastal change monitoring system. And so really try to stay abreast in those ways, and as far as, from a local government perspective, but I'm sure my academic colleagues will have some other venues that they'd like to mention.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and a great perspective there, Tiffany. I was thinking about that, and some aspects like forming good partnerships, and best practices in research, and the kind of data analysis and methods are certainly scalable relatively easily. The problem that we're always running into with hydrology and also climate, that I feel, is, so we have these geographic regions that often are very unique in terms of their settings and in terms of their experiences, and very local experiences, and then they intersect with kind of the political boundaries and the laws that apply to this region, and the policies and the management that's going on there. So that's when we end up with smaller and smaller scales, down to the experience in particular communities, which is why we're all in this work, and which is valuable, I think cannot so easily be transferred to a place in, I don't know, the Northeast, or the Midwest, for example. But I'd love to hear what other people think on that.
Yeah, this is Heather Community Water Center, and I agree. I mean, I think there are different cases, different states, and throughout, the world, even parts of California are different in terms of contaminants and distance to nearby water systems and things like that. There was a really interesting report by the U.S. Water Alliance with Dig Deep, that Community Water Center. We were one of the case studies. The work we do in California, and Susana, our executive director, participated in their advisory group. Others here were probably involved, but I'll paste what I think is the right link here, and then maybe somebody can help me find it if this isn't it. But it features, I think there are things that you can glean from, the work that's being done at the local level. It may not directly apply to other places, but we can learn from these other cases and come up with best practices. And I think some of those are mentioned in this report.
Here's another question. Is there any known plan for the state to establish standardized requirements for public outreach or participation, and/or best practices, for example, in the SIGMA program?
Hi, this is Tiffany again. In terms of the state of California, there is certainly a lot of engagement through the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, providing guidance on public outreach and engagement, particularly as it pertains to SB 1000, which requires an environmental justice element in the general plan of a jurisdiction that has CalEnviroScreen defined disadvantaged communities. There is also the budget that was just approved, $3.7 million for climate adaptation in California, that also advances regional climate collaboratives as the entities that can assist in standardizing engagement, particularly with respect to equity. And there are a lot of resources with respect to integration of equity and equitable engagement coming out as well. So there's a couple things that I know about on the state level.
This is Heather again. I just posted a link. The state does have guidance on things like stakeholder engagement and Sigma. You can see there's a guidance document on this website. I think our experience, this came up in an earlier question and around the Sigma presentation. I personally have participated in groundwater sustainability agency meetings from prior to Sigma. And, and I have had a seat at the table on the advisory committee for one. But it doesn't mean that we're listened to. So I think even as an advocate, so I think participation is one thing, having these mechanisms so I can speak, but actually making real changes to how communities are engaged or how advocacy groups like ours are listened to is still an issue that remains to be not yet resolved. So you can have a seat at the table and be ignored without power. And so that's what I feel personally. And I think others feel that throughout the state.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's see, I had a question actually for Iris and Marisol about the outreach that's being done by the CV Salts program. I was just curious about what sort of outreach is being done to try to communicate with groups which are possibly, not being possibly marginalized groups or.
Right. That was one of our comments, because the outreach that had been done had been a handful of Zoom meetings. And especially given what internet connection speeds are, especially in the rural areas, we can imagine that a lot of people who are affected were not able to join. And so that was part of our comments. I know, they mentioned a lot that COVID was one of the big issues, but going forward, what they are planning on doing is having in-person meetings. They did run an article in the Modesto Bee, and so that really had a huge impact on the number of people who responded and were asking for help with their wells. For us, we're going to be partnering with them and actually going out into the communities and doing door-to-door outreach. And so part of the work that Iris did helped us to identify the communities that were most at risk so that we can target those first and just get some of our community workers to do that door-to-door outreach. So really, trying to work as much as possible with the agency, but also trying to hold them accountable to do the outreach that they should be doing.
Thank you.
Claire, I think that there's also still a couple of questions in the chat, maybe. I think there's one on, as global warming is causing more severe droughts, we need a long-term ecological solution, which brings the question of how important vegetation is for rainfall. Do you think if we plant the plants that create rain clouds on massive scales, it can mitigate the drought? I'm wondering if we can expand this question a little bit in thinking about more longer term solutions, or what needs to happen, or are we on the right path for these longer term solutions, including ecological and long-term sustainability? I'd love to hear from everybody about that. I mean, including the participants. I'm wondering, Darcy, if you can talk a little bit about the sustainability aspect of Sigma, which seems vexing, and longer, suggestions for longer term ecological solutions.
Yeah, I will say the Nature Conservancy has done a lot of work on this, particularly focused on groundwater dependent ecosystems and how best we can support those ecosystems with declining groundwater levels. I don't know about specific plants or vegetation that could be better, planted, but there is legislation ongoing right now that discusses, the best ways to reuse or, reuse land that has been fallowed as a result. So land that can no longer be used for agricultural production, and that's being spearheaded again by the Nature Conservancy and also the Environmental Defense Fund. Yeah, sustainability has a lot of different definitions, and I think we have to, balance a lot of different interests.
Marisol, do you sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, this is Heather. One interesting thing, well, I think it's interesting that the Salinas Valley Groundwater Agency, they have one of their main projects is invasive species removal on the Salinas River, because those invasive species use a lot of water. So I think it's like thinking about plants. For me, that comes up locally. And then there are also a lot of projects like that are looking at more ecological approaches, things like preserving the ecosystem function upstream in like meadows and wetlands, present in sort of more in the foothills or in the mountains. So I know that there are more holistic approaches that some are considering that really do involve plants. So just a couple things to add. And I second the Nature Conservancy's work, groundwater dependent ecosystems. They've made a lot of, I'm just seeing on the ground, their work is happening throughout the state around groundwater dependent ecosystems. It's throughout the groundwater agencies. So yeah, really, really important work.
Yeah, and I totally agree on all this important work. And as a researcher, bringing my perspective, in having done some climate work, I'm still frustrated by the political processes and how we're working on these small steps of progress. And what I think needs to happen is much more larger scale reshuffling of what we're doing with water in general. And I'm just wondering where where we can join forces to have a louder voice on this. We're in the middle of another severe drought year, and we're not changing basic premises that get us to the place where we are in terms of drawing down the groundwater, not connecting people to water systems, how we're sharing water, how we're doing water pricing.
Well, thank you everybody so much. I want to remind everybody that everyone is invited to stay on for sort of a coffee chat, an informal networking session. But since I know people have busy schedules, I also want to make sure that I thank everybody today for participating. And I especially want to thank all of our presenters and our organizers for their contributions. Also, this is a really impressive turnout, especially for an event hosted in the summer after a holiday weekend. So thank you all for being here and for helping make this such a great conversation. Just a few very brief announcements. We will be sharing contact info for the registrants of this group, among those of you who indicated that was your preference at registration. I would also encourage you to reach out to potential collaborators within this network. And as we've seen today in today's presentations and in the list of attendees, there really are a lot of research synergies and opportunities for community academic collaborations, as well as interinstitutional collaborations. You can learn more about potential collaborators by joining the Northern California Environmental Justice Network and mailing list, which will circulate information about upcoming events and is also a great resource. And I believe we have Iris's email listed if you'd like to be included in that mailing list. Also, please reach out if you have ideas for future presentation topics, or if you're interested in presenting your work. This is a really great opportunity for anybody, but also for postdoc researchers and early career faculty, just to improve visibility of their work and develop collaborations. As just an aside, I'm a postdoc for UC Berkeley, and being part of this group and network has been a really great way to build community and share some of the research my group's been a part of. So don't hesitate to reach out to me or to the other organizers. One of the events you'll get information on upcoming is a Stanford workshop that will be September 15th. That will be shared through the EJ network and others on this call if we have a moment to talk about that. So we'll be taking about a 5-minute break, and then we'll be having an informal networking session. So thank you one more time to all our presenters, organizers, and attendees.